Hi there! In this video we're going to be painting these two cherries. Sometimes it's challenging to get very bright reds with watercolor, and I thought this was a good exercise in layering to achieve those bright colors. First I'm going to draw the outlines of the cherries. I'm using a number 2 pencil, and I'm trying to draw lightly so that my pencil lines don't show up in the final painting. When I'm happy with my drawing, I use a kneaded eraser to lightly go over my pencil lines and lighten them even more. For my first layer, I'm trying to get a very light wash of pinkish red over the whole cherries. I'm adding plenty of water. I'm planning on this layer being the final highlight color on those cherries. I'm also mixing a puddle of thicker consistency paint, still in that rose color. I will use this paint to charge in darker values. I'm using my thinner consistency paint to color within the lines. I recommend turning your paper or sketchbook as needed, anything that allows you the most comfortable hand position while you're painting. When I'm finished laying in the paint, I wash my brush, dry it on my towel, and use it to wick up the extra puddling paint. With this wash still wet, I'm picking up the creamier consistency paint and laying in the darker rose color. I'm looking at my reference and painting around those lighter highlights. Wherever I pick up my brush, I expect it to dump extra pigment down on the paper. Any place that I want more control is where I start my brush stroke, and I go towards the edge of the paint to lift up my brush. I follow these same steps on the second cherry, painting a flat wash of the watery paint first, and then charging in the thicker paint while the first layer is still wet. I let this first layer dry completely before moving on to the stems. If you paint the stem while the red cherry is still wet, there's a higher likelihood of bleeding paints. Sometimes that can have a beautiful effect, but for this painting, I wanted clean edges between the two objects. I grabbed some nickel azo yellow paint that I had left over from a different project. Any yellow would work here. I picked up my sap green color, or my yellowish green, from my palette, and I knew that it would be too bright straight out of the pan. To tone down this green, I added some of my rose color from my previous puddle of paint. I paint the stems with my yellow color. Then I decided that I wanted a more neutral brown, yellow, cream color up where those stems meet. So I mixed some yellow ochre with my existing green mixture and a lot of water. I painted my green mixture along the right side of these stems, cleaned my brush, then used my brush tip to blend this green with the yellow. Now the cherries and stems are both dry, and I'll be adding a blue background. I use an eyedropper to put a lot of water down in my little palette, and then start mixing in some ultramarine blue paint and phthalo blue paint. After I mix my blue, I want to mix a neutral gray color that will be the shadows under the cherries. Since I'm finished with my green paint, I decide to use that existing puddle of paint to work off of. First, I add more of my rose color. This is browner than I like, so I begin to add some more blue. When I'm laying in a large flat wash, I want to start in a place where I can leave edges. This is why I chose to start in between the stems of the cherries, because I can let the areas touching the stems dry. When I've filled in between the stems, I make sure there's a nice bead of paint left at the bottom so that it won't dry. And then I pick up my gray paint and I charge in a shadow. The shadows in this reference are very soft, and so my paint isn't very dark. Once the gray is placed in, I clean my brush and I continue painting the blue. I use a similar charging technique in the shadows under the cherries. Once I've filled in the area with blue paint, I charge in some gray paint to make the shadows. I continue painting blue around my shapes, careful to not let any edges dry while I'm working in different areas. Once I've filled in the background, I let the painting dry completely. For my next layer on the cherries, I want to add a more scarlet red. I'm painting every part of the cherry except for their lightest highlight. I decided to leave out the water droplets that are visible in the reference for the sake of this tutorial. While this layer is still damp, I go in with my clean, damp brush and soften the edge around the highlight. To do this, I just lightly wiggle my brush over the line between the paint and the highlighted area. This doesn't need to be a perfect seamless blend. I am just softening that edge. I follow these same steps for the second cherry, and then allow this layer to dry. This is the layer that really allows that red to start popping. I mix my rose color with my violet, and I add it to the puddle of scarlet that's already on my palette. I'm aiming for a red wine sort of color. I use this color to paint the darkest shapes of the cherries. Once I have these shapes filled in, I use my softening technique from the prior layer. add some of my violet and some more green into my yellow ochre puddle of paint, and use this to paint the dark areas on the stem. The stems are so thin, it's hard to get a very soft gradient, but I do lightly soften these areas. I decided to do one final layer of my scarlet paint over the entire area of the cherries. This helps to further blend the layers underneath, and it deepens the red tones of the cherries. My final step is to mix up a little more of that wine red mixture and add my darkest tones just to the edges of these cherries. I make sure not to outline the cherries. I only add my deepest accents. After the paint is placed, I clean and dry my brush and soften the edge. Once that's done, the cherries are complete. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.